All right. So yes, so what I wanted to talk about today is querying and analyzing big scientific data. The reason being that we have been working on this for the last couple of years in the context of the Human Brain Project as well as the Blue Brain Project. And the really reason why we have been working on it is that scientific discovery has been evolving in the last couple of years. So essentially we've gone from hypothesis-driven scientific discovery to nowadays also featuring kind of this data-driven scientific discovery. And what that essentially means is that, we no longer first build a hypothesis and then test it through carefully chosen and designed experiments. What we do instead, not necessarily instead, but increasingly more often, is that we just collect a number of data. We just collect as much data as we can. For example, in astronomy, we just scan the entire sky at night and collect as much data as we can. And using this data, not just based on the data, but also using this data, we develop a hypothesis that we then also test. And that's not just true for astronomy. This is also true for other sciences. This is true for fluid dynamics, for example, where no longer we simply or solely develop models, phenomenon and solve this analytically. But what we instead do is that we simulate these phenomena on computing infrastructure, on supercomputing infrastructure. And this trend towards data-driven scientific discovery leads to massive amounts of data. So in the Large Hadron Collider experiments, we collect about 12 petabytes of data per experiment. In the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, we collect 4 petabytes per year. And that's about to change with the successor of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, with the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. There, it's going to be 4 petabytes of data, not per year, but per night. And in the Human Brain Project, by and large, in the simulation aspect of the project, we collect about 100 gigabytes of data per simulation second. So the amounts of data are growing rapidly, are growing extremely fast. And scientists are overwhelmed with these amounts of data, with analyzing these amounts of data. Because it's not just about storing this data, it's also about analyzing it. And it's also not just that the data is big, it's growing. And it's growing at a rapid pace. I tried with this slide here, to show how it's growing in different sciences and the reasons for that. So what you see here is on the y-axis the cumulative size of data sets in petabytes, and on the x-axis time or years. And you can see, or you can tell, this is not entirely up to date, this slide, but it serves the purpose of demonstrating how fast data grows in different disciplines. So for example, in astronomy, data grows very, very fast. There it's thanks to bigger experiments and more sensitive equipment, high resolution of the sensors. That's what makes the data grow there. In physics, it's the same. It grows even faster. There it's also, again, it's the size of the experiments as well as the resolution of the equipment, or the sensitivity of the equipment. In the simulation sciences, it's essentially how powerful the computers are that we use to simulate phenomena, how powerful the supercomputers are. And in gene sequencing, it's slightly different. There it's essentially because the equipment has become much cheaper. So we can sequence more data, more genomes in parallel, and that leads to if you will, into an explosion of the amounts of data. So the scientific data grows super linear, and that basically means we need new methods to analyze this data. And that's what I want to talk about today. Now, more specifically, if you look at the simulation sciences, there the data grows along 3 different dimensions. We have the coverage. So essentially, we increase the model size that we simulate, the phenomenon. This is enabled through better computational infrastructure. And that makes data grow, right? The output data as well as the input data. We also increase the resolution. I'm not sure how well you can see this. I can see it brilliantly on my screen here, but the projector doesn't show it very well. What I want to show there is that we increase the resolution of the models. So for example, a couple of years back, we used very rough approximations of neurons, each neuron approximated with a couple of thousand cylinders. Nowadays, we increase the resolution and we use very, very detailed surface mesh models, and that increases the size of the model itself, but also the size of the simulation output, because for every point in this, right, we're going to have values over time. And then finally, duration, we increase the duration, and that in itself, so we just let the simulations run for much longer, and that in itself also leads to more simulation data, output of our simulation that needs to be analyzed. And these dimensions are not independent of each other. They are in fact multiplicative, so we typically increase the coverage, increase the duration and the resolution at the same time, and that leads to massively more data. And in the simulation sciences, that's what I'm focusing on in this talk. We have a few challenges that I try to summarize here by showing them on the workflow in the simulation sciences. Right? We start with a set of observational data. We use this observational data to build models, typically spatial models, at least in the work that we have done in the context of the Human Brain Project. We build these spatial models, we then feed them into simulation, where we then, well, essentially simulate the models. That produces post-simulation data, the output of the simulation, that we then also need to analyze. Now the challenges that we have identified in the context of this workflow are essentially the static 3D exploration, interactive 3D exploration, spatial analysis, as well as the dynamic 3D exploration. So what you can tell by these challenges, by the names I use for these challenges, is it says a lot of 3D and spatial, right? And those are essentially the challenges that we addressed in our work. We need spatial access methods in each step of the workflow of the simulation sciences to build the models and to simulate the models. Now, essentially this slide also gives you a bit of an idea of the structure of the remainder of the talk. I want to talk about 3 of these challenges, for reasons of time only on the first, second and fourth challenge. All right, so with that, let me talk about the static 3D exploration. The problem here is that in the work of the neuroscientists in the Human Brain Project or the Blue Brain Project with whom we have worked, what they do is they build spatial models of brain tissue. And more precisely, they take realistic, kind of realistic representations of neurons, single neurons, like it is shown on the left. Again, this is an approximation with cylinders. Per neuron, we have about several thousand cylinders, kind of really trying to represent the spatial extent of the neuron. And what they do is they put together a model with several hundreds of thousands of these neurons, right? As I try to illustrate on the right-hand side. And now when they do this, when they put this together, they need to make sure that this model actually represents a realistic, some kind of realistic tissue, right? And to do so, they execute several hundreds or thousands of spatial range queries on this model, just to check whether or not the density of the model is correct, the composition of the different cells is correct, and so on. Now, because this is not just one query they need to execute, they need to know exactly in different areas of this model the density and the composition. So they execute several hundreds or thousands of these queries. They need efficient spatial indexes. That's crucial for their work. Otherwise, it just essentially slows down what they are doing. So efficient spatial indexes are crucial for this work. Now, this is not a new problem, spatial indexes. This has been looked at for decades. I think the first spatial indexes were developed maybe 40 years ago. So there's a whole bunch of work about this. There's several different variants. And the most famous or the most important, the seminal work is the R-tree. Even of that, there's several different variants. I just want to explain briefly how the R-tree works and then show what the problems are and then basically tell you what we have done about these problems. So the R-tree tries to pack the spatial objects. In our case, these are cylinders, and I try to make an example on the left-hand side, just a few few tens of cylinders. So what the R tree does, it packs all of these objects recursively or hierarchically into minimum bounding rectangles. So it takes each of the objects, packs them, and I try to illustrate this here with these blue cells, so these blue rectangles, and then it does that recursively. So in this instance, right, it packs into every blue rectangle one object, and then in the next step it packs several blue rectangles into red rectangles on one level of the hierarchy higher, and this then does so recursively with green rectangles and so on until it packs everything into one minimum bounding rectangle. And as I was explaining this, how this packs on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, the illustration essentially built a hierarchical representation of this, right? This is a tree essentially, and like I said, there are many of these, many variants of these ideas have been implemented, have been developed. Unfortunately, all of them suffer from the same problem, and that's the overlap. Now, but before I explain overlap, if we execute a query on this tree, for example, so what we, how does this work? Is this a point? Yeah. So basically, if I execute a query here, right, a range query, a rectangular query, I will traverse the entire hierarchy on the right down until I find the blue boxes. That's the essential idea. Now the problem is that, so I start with the range query at the top, check with which box it intersects, with which rectangle it intersects, then go down to the next level, check recursively all the children of the boxes that intersect, and so on until I'm at the blue level. Right? That's the idea of the R tree. Now the problem is the overlap. And you can see the overlap also in the illustration on the left-hand side. Some of the green boxes overlap here, and that leads to ambiguity in the path that we need to follow. So when we execute the range query, we check at the top, does it intersect with the black box, the black minimum bounding rectangle? It does. We go to the children, right? It intersects with two of them, the query, and from there we have to follow recursively all the paths down. So this overlap is an issue. It leads to an ambiguity in the path, and it's not just like I showed here with two paths that we need to evaluate. Typically it leads to hundreds and thousands of different paths. Ideally it would just be one, right? The one that leads to the result, but unfortunately it's thousands of paths, and that really makes execution of queries on this index structure much slower. And so this structural overlap degrades the performance of the R tree, of all the variants of R trees. And I want to illustrate this with an experiment. So we took a data set, 100,000 neurons, which basically is represented with 450 million 3D cylinders, and we executed range queries on top of that. And this is essentially the setup, right? We measured time on the y-axis, and we increased the data density, the number of neurons in the data set, on the x-axis. So we increased what we call spatial density. And we tested this, or we measured this for several different variants of this R tree, for the Hilbert, STR, and PR tree. And what we measured here is essentially that this grows linear, right? The state of the art essentially grows linear in the execution time. The bigger the data set, or the bigger the model, the longer it takes for these queries to execute. And that's not the way it's supposed to be. Indexes really, their purpose is for me to know exactly where in the data set do I need to look at. Their purpose really is to decouple execution time, query time, if you will, from the size of the model, from the size of the data set. So they really fail badly in this example. So the state of the art does not scale with the density. And that's clearly not ideal, right? So what we have done is we thought about how can we address this issue? How can we make this type of index scale? Because what we'd like to see is a line that really is entirely flat. And if my hand wasn't shaking, it would actually be flat, what I'm trying to show, right? That's the idea, to decouple execution time, query time from the model size. So we came up with this index we call flat, which is two-faced spatial index. The idea being that both faces are essentially independent of this problem of overlap, because the problem of overlap can't be just simply done away. It's structural, it's inherent in the data sets. So we designed these two faces, a first face where we essentially find any one object in the range query. The blue dotted line is supposed to be the range query. So we find any one object, and then starting from this object, we look around and try to find the rest of the query, right, the query result. And that basically means we don't need any type of hierarchy. That doesn't necessarily affect that doesn't have any problems with the overlap. So we seed, we find any one object, and then we crawl, we traverse the neighborhood until we have the entire result. That's the idea. So we want to use this connectivity to avoid the overlap. Now there's a tiny catch here, which is essentially that we don't necessarily have connectivity in the data set. There's no inherent connectivity, right? If you look at this, data set, right, we can't go from this part here to that part here. There's no connection between them, right? We don't have anything that connects them. So what we've done is we introduce this reachability or this connectivity during the index building phase. We essentially take the data set, we group spatially closed objects into the same minimum rectangle box, right? Or minimum bounding rectangle, I should say. And then we link these neighboring parts together. So we link each neighboring partition with, well, this reachability information together. We add this kind of connectivity that then enables us to crawl the neighborhood recursively. Now, the next step is we need to find an initial element to start the search with, right? The idea really being we find kind of what partition our query intersects with. One of them, doesn't really matter which one, and then we use this link information here to traverse the neighborhood. That's the idea, but we need to find the first element. And that's a slightly counterintuitive, because what we actually do, we want to find any one object, we actually use an R tree for this. And I've just been bashing R trees quite badly, right? I said how poorly they perform. But what we do is we use just a query to find any one object. We don't want to find all the objects. And finding any one object can be done efficiently because we just need to follow one path down the tree. We don't want to find all of them, we just want to find one. So with that, we can essentially make this seeding step quite efficient, right? So we use this R tree, we just find one element in the result, and then we crawl from there. And I try to represent this here, right? We find any one object with the tree, with the seed query we call it, that points us to one partition, and then we try to find all the neighboring partitions with this connectivity that we introduced. And so essentially we have two steps now. Two steps. The seeding step, which is find any one object, that doesn't suffer from overlap. And then we have a second step, which is the crawling step, that does also not depend on the overlap problem. It only depends on the size of the result of the query, right? So we have two steps ultimately, seeding and crawling, which both avoid the overlap overhead. And that's what's supposed to make flat efficient. Now we have, of course, tested that. We did a performance evaluation of that. We take the same data set that I've shown before, 100,000 neurons represented by 450 million 3D cylinders, 27 gigabytes on disk, not necessarily big, but we can already see really performance problems with this type of data set size. We executed range queries, 500 uniform distributed range queries on the data set. And what we see is this is the same setup as before. The y-axis shows time, execution time for the queries. And the x-axis shows the size of the model or of the data set. It's being the same thing in this instance. And we compared this for the Hilbert R tree, the SCR R tree, and the PR tree. These are the same curves that we've seen before. They don't scale, or they scale linear, which is not what's supposed to happen, right? We're supposed to see a rather flat line, and that's essentially what flat precisely does, right? It shows a rather flat line compared to the others, and that means really it decouples the execution time from the data set size. And for the biggest model that we measured it, the improvement is about a factor of 7.8 times faster than the best known R3 variant, than the best known spatial index that we could find. And that makes a huge difference in the work, of course. So like I said, it decouples execution time from density, from the size of the data set. More importantly, however, is the scalability. So we also measured how much time does it take per result set, right? Because when you look at this graph here, this experiment, when we go to the right, when we increase the size of the data set, the size of the model, also the number of results increase. Because it's getting denser, right? The query size stays the same, but the model size increases, and so the result set size increases as such. So we measured the time it takes for each result set element, and that's essentially we changed the y-axis. The x-axis stayed the same. We increased the number of cylinders used in the data set. And for all of the other approaches, this essentially grows slowly, but it grows as the result set increases, except for flat, where it actually shrinks a little bit. The reason for it shrinking is that we have a constant overhead. We have two types of overheads. We have the one overhead for seeding, so how much time it takes for seeding. That's a constant overhead. And then we have the overhead of retrieving each result element, and that depends on the number of result elements. So we have the seeding cost, which is constant, and that's being amortized over more a higher number of results as we go on to the right on the x-axis, and that means the curve shrinks a little bit. But that's important. It scales much better. It actually shrinks as we increase the data set size. So the trend is flat, and that means it scales with the density. All right, so we addressed one of the challenges. I want to talk about two other challenges that we worked on, for which we developed approaches. We have worked also on the interactive 3D exploration. This is a problem where essentially scientists try to follow a structure, and this is really difficult to see. Can you see there is something there? All right, let's see how this works. This is supposed to be a neural network. Anyway, you all, I'm sure, know what a neural network might look like. But what I want to say is, this is essentially a spatial representation of a neural network, and a lot of the analysis that we've seen in the Blue Brain project are essentially a sequence of range queries, spatial range queries that follow a structure in the data set. And I'm trying to retrace the neural network here because you probably can't see it. But what I want to say here is a lot of the patterns we have seen are sequences of range queries that follow a structure that is in the data set. So it's not just random queries. And this is, so they follow some sort of guiding path through the data set. That's not just true for the neural network, this is also true for the arterial tree of the heart. Also there we work with scientists who execute range queries along the arterial tree, or also the bronchial tree of the lung. This I think is a bit better. You can see a bit better. But also there we have structures in the data set, in the spatial data set, and these are the structures users follow. The queries are not just random. So there's always, frequently, is this guided analysis, and it's ubiquitous in scientific applications. Now, the way these queries are executed, or these guiding queries along guiding paths are executed, is that they're not known in advance, right? You basically execute the query, look at the result, you analyze the result, and then you decide where to execute the next query. So the path of the execution is decided after analyzing the results. So we can't just execute all queries in one go. That would be too simple, right? So the way this looks for the computer is essentially that we first, I try to show this here with the CPU, processor, and the disk. So we first essentially have a first query, retrieve the query results from the disk here. We then process the result. The results are shown to the user, to some user. the one analyzing the result. The user decides where to execute the next query. We go again to the disk to execute the second query, retrieve the result of the second query, process the result. The user decides again where to execute the next query. Then we go to the third query, and so on. Fairly simple, right? But the problem being that we don't know the queries in advance, so we can't really retrieve the data in one go. So every time we have to wait until the user has analyzed the query, and only then can we execute the next one. But there is a prefetching opportunity here. In between these two queries, the disk is idle, and we could technically retrieve data that we think might be useful, right? So what we need to do is to predict the next query location in the sequence, prefetch the data so it's already ready, so in order to accelerate this analysis. So what we do is we execute the first query, then we spend some time predicting where might the next query be. We then process the results as we did before. In the meantime, while we process the results and analyze the results and present it to the user, we prefetch data that we might be able to use for the next query. We do that, then when the second query is about to be executed, we only have to retrieve, in the ideal case, we only have to retrieve a little bit of data, whilst we predict the next query, and so on. So what we essentially try to do is to keep the disk busy while we process the results and present them to the user, and we want to essentially predict as much useful data or prefetch as much useful data as possible. So this predictive prefetching, what we want to do with that is really to hide the data retrieval cost. Ideally, the ideal situation really is, once the user is at this point here, once the data is processed and analyzed, the user decides on the next query, we already have all the data loaded in main memory and don't have to go to the disk. That's what we want to do. Now, this is not a fundamentally new concept. I'm sure some of you have heard of prefetching, and there's also been some work done for spatial data, for kind of that works with these applications that we're looking at. But most of the previous work is built on extrapolating past query locations. There's three particular approaches. There's the exponential weighted moving average, there's a straight line approach, and also Hilbert prefetching. The problem with them is they don't work particularly well. So here we try to measure, we didn't just try, we measured on the y-axis the cache hit rate. That's essentially expressing how much data how much of the data that we prefetched is actually going to be useful, right? Is actually going to be used by the next query. So the higher, the better. And on the x-axis, we compared different volumes of queries. And it's not all bad news. I find it's reasonably good news for small queries, in that one of the approaches, this exponential weighted moving average, actually accomplishes a cache hit rate for almost 50% for neuroscience data set with 15 queries in the sequence. But the problem is that as we go bigger with the query, as we increase the query volume, the cache hit rate really drops dramatically, even just below 10%, even below 5%. And that's not good enough. So we analyzed what the problem might be. And what we found out is that it doesn't really work well, or these known approaches that just are based on past query locations, they don't work well for big queries because they can't predict the sequence quite well. It works really well, trying to show this again, for small queries, because each of the locations will be fairly close to the previous queries, but it doesn't work well for large volume queries, because the structure, the guiding path that the user is following, twists, bends, bifurcates in this large volume, arbitrarily so, and might just exit at a completely different location than we predict here, right? So that's the problem with large volume queries. So the problem really is of the state of the art is that it doesn't work well for large queries, not well for arbitrary query volumes. So what we have done is we thought, just using the past query location is enough. That doesn't deliver us good results. What we've come up with is this approach that we kind of call Scout Content-Aware Prefetching, that looks at the previous query content. So we look at the query content, we inspect it, we try to identify the guiding path, and then we predict the next query, the next query location. The problem is that there might be a lot of different guiding paths, right? This is a representation, this is downsample representation of a neural network that we experimented with, and it's really hard to find the guiding path in there. So we need to do that. Now what we decided is that, or kind of our key insight here is that the guiding path goes through all queries executed. So we start initially with multiple paths, thousands of paths, and we then check for the first query which path go through this query. Those are our kind of that's our candidate set of guiding path, right? And then with each query that we execute consecutively, we can reduce that set, because like I said, right, our key insight is the guiding path must go through all these queries. And the further we go, right, it's in the next query, it's only going to be 2 paths that go through this, through all these queries, and so on. And after a few queries only, we can actually reliably identify this guiding path, and then we can extrapolate and predict the next query location based on this information, right? The key insight really being that the guiding path must go through all these past queries. And the longer the sequence, the better we can predict. But in fact, the reality is that already after a few queries, we can quite reliably identify one of the guiding path. And so we have tested how well our approach does. We tested the prediction accuracy. Then I think we use even just the same data set as with flat data set with about 100,000 neurons, represented by 450 million 3D cylinders. Now what we've done is we measured here again the cache hit rate on the y-axis, and then we compared 2 different sequences, one with bigger queries, a query volume of 80k cubic meters, 20k, and we tested both with a sequence length of 32. And the result is quite clear. So as we already know, the state of the art doesn't work very well, doesn't give us a very good cache hit rate still, but then for Scout, for our method, it goes up to 70%. So we improved quite a bit over the state of the art. For smaller queries, it's even a bit better for us. Then again, also the state of the art is better, but we can go beyond 90% for smaller queries even. And yeah. All right, so we get, with Scout, we get a prediction accuracy of 72 to 91%. And more importantly than the prediction accuracy, if we look at the acceleration, I mean, this prediction actually, the accuracy helps us to accelerate the execution of the whole sequence of queries, right? It makes it more interactive for the user. And what we can tell by just basically measuring the acceleration or the speed up, for the state of the art, the speed up was about a factor of 2. For Scout, using Scout, because we have a higher prediction accuracy, a better cache hit rate, the speed up goes up to 14.7x, right? And that's a considerable speed up that translates into a really solid speed up in the work of scientists working with this type of data. All right, so that was essentially the second approach that we developed that I wanted to talk about. Now I'm going to move to the third one, which is the one about dynamic 3D exploration. The question here is, this is the one, if I go back, I can probably even show it, right? This is the one challenge that we identified during the simulation. And the problem really is to kind of monitor the mesh, how it evolves throughout the simulation in main memory of the computing infrastructure. So what we've done is, so the question really is, how can we track or how can we execute spatial range queries on top of tetrahedral meshes which model the surface or the volume of neurons that are being deformed throughout the process, throughout the simulation. So what we want to really do is, throughout every time step in a simulation, we want to be able to execute the range queries, again illustrated with a three-dimensional box here, on a surface mesh or also on the volume mesh. Right? And to illustrate that, what that means is really we have a simulation that in the simulation time step, so we have simulation where we have a simulation time step followed by a monitoring time step, followed again by of course simulation time step, and so on. Now during the simulation time step we have loads of updates of the positions of the mesh triangles of the tetrahedral mesh, right? And then in the monitoring phase we execute a few queries of this mesh to maybe visualize it, to check on other parameters, could be anything really, but we know how, but the pattern really is we have simulation time steps followed by a monitoring time step. In the simulation time step we have a few, we have massive updates, and in the monitoring time step we have a few queries that are being executed. Then of course is again, like I said before, this is followed again by a simulation time step where we have massive updates, and then again by a monitoring time step where you have a few queries. That's essentially the pattern. And the question here is, how can we make this execution of the queries efficient on this dynamic data set that changes rapidly in every dynamic data set? Now again here, we're not the first to necessarily look at this problem. There has been quite a bit of research already done in this area of kind of moving objects, it's usually typically called in the database community. So there is a whole class of indexes called the moving object indexes that tries to accommodate change in the data set. They have been designed for indexing moving objects like cars or other kind of clearly defined movements, and they try to essentially make a bit bigger bounding boxes so they don't have to be updated quite as much. The problem is they don't work very well for us because the mesh movement isn't very predictable, as opposed to cars, for example. You know, a car is going to drive probably a straight line for a couple of meters at least, and only then you need to run an update. But that doesn't work very well for us. Then another option to use kind of state-of-the-art indexes is the static spatial indexes. One example being the R tree that I already explained before, right? We have other indexes that we can use. And the idea here essentially being that we use a static spatial index. In every time step we build the index, use it for the queries, and then throw it away. The problem here is this is not very efficient, simply because it takes quite some time to build the index, to build the R tree, and then we only execute a few queries. That is essentially the problem, right? So it becomes quite inefficient. Another idea, this is the most simple of them all, is to just scan over the whole data set and execute the queries on top of it. That's actually not too bad, and as I'll show, this is one of the best ways of doing it. The problem with it, however, is it doesn't scale very well. If we go from a coarse-grained model representation to fine-grained one, the problem becomes that the size grows quite rapidly, right? It grows cubically, and with that also the time to execute a linear scan becomes cubic. So the known approaches don't scale well with size or with detail. So what we have done, we came up with we developed a new approach that we call OCTOPUS. We use the Keyinsight that we can use the mesh connectivity to retrieve the query results. This is quite similar to the idea of FLAT, where we use the connectivity, or where we actually add a connectivity to the data set to retrieve it recursively. Here we exploit that we already have kind of this connectivity inherent in the data set. And so again, we go into the range query, we find any one of the vertices, and then just follow the edges to retrieve recursively the entire result. We can do this in every time step, no matter how the mesh changes, how it's being deformed. In every time step, we can execute the query, find any random element inside the query, and then recursively retrieve the remaining result sets. And this is great because we don't have to do anything. This is update oblivious, right? The structure of the mesh is going to be updated through the simulation anyway, and we just exploit that type of this type of information. There's a slight catch though, and that's pretty much the main work that we've done. What can we do about non-convex meshes? Because there, if we have a problem like this here, right, if we have a hole in the middle of the mesh, the querying both across it, we can find a random element, but there won't be any way to recursively retrieve the rest of the result. And we could, of course, go outside the query, but then it's difficult to tell where to go and where to end, etc. So that could become endless. So we don't have reachability within the query. So what we've done is we said, well, essentially what we have to do is we simply identify all the surface elements. We use surface scan to find all the surface elements of the mesh. That's great as long as the surface doesn't change too much. And then we start from each surface element within the query result, as these elements here, right? We start the recursive search and retrieve the result. That essentially assures accuracy or correctness of the result. With that, we know we're going to retrieve all the elements in the range query, no matter if they're split by this by holes in the mesh. So that's the idea, right? And no matter how the graph changes, no matter if we just deform the mesh, the surface isn't going to change. So that's quite efficient as long as the surface doesn't change. If the surface changes, we again have to analyze what are the surface elements. Typically that's not, in our experience at least in the use cases that we've seen, this is not very frequent that the surface indeed changes. And with that we have a method that scales with massive updates. And there's it gets even a bit better in the sense that if we increase the mesh detail, what happens is that the surface points will increase quadratically, whereas the mesh elements will increase cubically, or the non-surface points will increase cubically. So we will scale better than any approach that depends on the number of elements in the entire data set, in the number of points of the mesh. So we scale better with the mesh resolution than other approaches. Now, also here we have evaluated the performance of the approach. Here we took a different data set. We took a tetrahedral mesh, 33 gigabyte in memory, and we executed a total of 900 queries. We compared it only against the linear scan. The problem being that, or not the problem necessarily, but the linear scan compared to all other state-of-the-art approaches is simply the fastest. So we took the linear scan and OCTOPUS and measured for increasing on the x-axis for increasing mesh detail. We measured the execution time, and it's quite clear that OCTOPUS performs substantially better, right? It's was considerably faster than the linear scan. So the speed up then becomes essentially as much as 22, I believe it is, or I know it's actually an 8 to 24x improvement in execution time for the queries. That's quite a considerable improvement, and like I said, this works very, very well as long as we don't have any update of the mesh surface, and also we haven't seen any kind of changes in the mesh surface in the experiments we've run and the use cases we've seen. Alright, so with that I would like to start concluding. I just wanted to talk about kind of summarizing the work we have done. Again, this is the workflow that we kind of identified in simulation sciences generally. We have developed several methods for spatial analysis. I haven't had time to talk about those touch and gypsy. I talked about the model validation, like I said, executing multiple queries, range queries, spatial range queries on the models. For this we have developed Flat and Scout, which both accelerate queries considerably. And for the simulation, we have developed OCTOPUS, which allows to monitor meshes efficiently during the execution, during the deformation of the mesh. And the work we've done, like I said initially, I believe, has been, we started with this work back when it was still called the Blue Brain Project, we first worked with some neuroscientists in the Blue Brain Project, and the work has had quite a considerable impact in that it allowed us to scale the models used in the project quite considerably, up to 10 millions. It was a few years back already. But it's also important to note that the work we've done is not specific to neuroscience. It can be used in other sciences as well. And so to conclude, so data exploration is key, or efficient data exploration, I should say, is key to scientific discovery. Data is growing very fast. Try to make this point at the beginning. We're seeing through cheaper equipment, through high resolution equipment, we gather much more data. We need to be able to analyze this efficiently. A lot of the methods that we have today are not or do not scale well. We've seen this particularly in the area we worked in spatial access methods, kind of spatial data. And so what we've done is we've developed several methods to deal with that. We've seen that this idea of spatial connectivity works quite well. It's something inherent in spatial data. We explicitly added it for flattened touch to make sure that it works, but it's already implicitly present, like I said, in the other data sets. For example, in meshes, we have the spatial connectivity, and so we just exploited this in OCTOPUS to allow these methods to scale much better and to ultimately deliver the results, the analysis, the insight considerably faster. And with that, I think I am done. Thank you very much for your attention.